All right, we're gonna get started. So tonight I wanted to go through um, some really important concepts in like building applications, building websites, programming in general. So the big word programming. Wanted to go through some things with that, so it makes a little more sense to everybody. Anybody have any questions before I start? There's a chat feature down at the bottom of your Zoom. I've turned that on, so feel free to post in the chat. And I'm going to be using that along the way as we go to get your input. So, share my screen here. So, what do we do when we start something? Like when we build an app, like how do we begin this whole process? I want to build a website. I want to build something cool. Where do developers begin? And so I want to answer that question. There's many ways to start based on how large your app is and the scale you want to achieve. But at the heart of a website, there's usually only about a couple of processes we can take. So let's just assume that you have an idea. So tonight I'm going to roll with an idea of building a recipe app or a recipe site that allows me to add recipes, track them, and view them at any time. So that's the concept we're going for here. But where would I start? So I have a site that I use called Lucidchart, and Lucidchart is it's a graphical program. It's kind of like a mix between Illustrator and maybe some graph programs you might have used before if you're doing any kind of graphing. But it's really cool in the sense that it's free to start, so you can use it without having to pay anything at first. But then you can upgrade if you want. But here, I will typically start by laying out what my app should look like. And I don't mean like I'm going to graphically design it here in front of me or on this website or on Lucidchart. I'm going to make a really basic, super basic box representation of my site layout. So I would start with like maybe if I want to have a header at the top of the page, I would have something like this, and I would make a header, and I'm just going to name it as I go. So something like this, right? And this lets me know, by doing something like this lets me know how things are going to work as far as the kind of the concept, or the eye sees the page when somebody visits my page. How is it going to flow for them? How is it going to work for them? Because a lot of times you'll get stuck, or you'll start coding and you'll do a lot of coding, and then you realize, oh man, this just isn't working out. I don't like the way it looks. It's not really flowing well. I need to rewrite a bunch of code. So before you write any code, it's good to like go in and just lay out the way it's going to be on the page, the kind of the box of content for each thing you're going to make on the page. Make a box for it. So let's say in the middle of a page, I'm just going to have a big section here that's going to show my recipes. Somebody have a question? All right. And then at the bottom, we're going to have a footer. This is really crazy. It looks pretty simple and basic, but it's going to help me to start building upon this idea of a recipe app. So maybe I want to have like a little plus sign over here, and this plus sign is going to be like larger. It's going to be like this big. And when I click on that, it's going to open up some kind of little form or something I can use to add a new recipe. So then I might say, well, I want a logo over here. So I would just add my logo there. And the name I came up with was Recipe Hero or something. I don't know. Well, we might come up with better names than that, but it sounded pretty cool to me. So Recipe Hero, there's my logo. There's my plus sign. And then maybe when I hit that plus sign, I'm going to open up a form. So I could just come down here. You can put this to the side. You can create pages as well. But I'm just going to really do the most basic thing here, which is just open this up down here. And this is going to be my form. And I could do the layout for the form here, but everybody's seen a form before. So if you go to Google and you type in website form ideas 2019, you hit images, you're going to see forms in all their glory. So this is what a form looks like. It's where you've given information to somebody before by typing in these little boxes, and then you hit some kind of button that says something, and that information is sent to that website or that that company, their application, and they get the information. They can do something with it. So that's the whole purpose of a form, just to submit a bunch of information and either store it somewhere or use it in some other way. Okay, and this form is going to pop up when I hit that plus sign. It's going to cover the whole entire page, so I don't see the rest of anything else I have. And it's going to have a little X up here. And when I hit that X, not that large, but I'm just going to leave it that large. When I hit that X, it's going to close the form, and we see the recipe, listing of all my recipes again. So that's the whole idea. And and this is called mocking up your website or mocking up your application. I'm sure you've all heard this term before, but you might not have done this yet. You might have just jumped into the code, started going. If you work with the group, I guess I should ask, has everybody done their group project yet with their first one yet? Or are y'all about to do your first group project? By the way, there's a chat box down at the bottom of your Zoom. Everybody can hit that chat, and you can type into that for me this evening. All right. Haven't done that yet. Okay, cool. Yeah, so pretty soon you're going to be working together with a group to build a website, build an application. What is an application? That word always sounds so technical. So we think, ooh, I'm not really up to application yet kind of level. But, surprisingly, you probably are up to an application level. And what does that mean? It means it's a way of processing. It means we can have a visual side of things. We can see something. We can click on things. We can, use things, make actions on the page, and we can possibly store some kind of information. You might not think you can store any information yet, but I'm going to show you tonight that you can. So, all right, here I am. I'm on a blank page here, or a blank folder here with no files at all. So tell me in the chat, what's the first thing I would probably do? If I have my idea, I get it all mocked up where I can actually see it. Let me do this and move this down here. All right, I have my idea mocked up. It's all ready. I know I need to start coding now because I'm ready to start coding this up. Basic HTML? Right, yeah. So you don't have to start with your JavaScript, and you shouldn't. We should start making the foundation for our application, our website. And the foundation of any website, any Yeah, really, application is going to be HTML. Now, when you start getting into backend later on in the class, you might start with backend first or something like that. But when you're building a basic website, the foundational element to that website is going to be an HTML file. So I'm going to start with an index HTML. Does anybody know why I start with index HTML? Why we use this weird name, index? Anybody know that? Right. So if you have your site on a server somewhere like GoDaddy or whatever else you might use, the server is going to look for a file to start things up because everything starts with one file. Whether you're doing a full stack application with backend and all the craziness, or you're just building a basic website, the server is going to look for one file to start the whole process. And the one file that it looks for initially is one called index. So it's going to look for index, right? And if it finds that, it's going to load that file, and that begins the whole process, right? So from this file, we can cause a chain of events to happen, right? We can load some CSS that's going to make the page look nice. We can load some JavaScript that allows us to add some functionality. But everything begins here, right? And so I'm going to make a basic little HTML, some syntax here. And we're going to put recipe hero into our title. And down here in the body, looking at my mock-up over here, what's the first thing that would come to your mind if you were thinking about building this page? Like, I know I have a really basic layout here, but what's the first thing that you'd probably do in your HTML? Bootstrap, header. Okay. Header sounds good. Yeah, so I'm just going to start from the top here and just kind of work my way down tonight. So header, first thing, let's get that going. I'm not going to actually include Bootstrap. So CSS is very powerful, and less and less like these days, people use Bootstrap and frameworks because CSS has become so powerful in what it can do by itself without having to put anything, wrap anything, or use any library or framework. So I'm just going to use straight vanilla CSS. Vanilla meaning just nothing on top of it, okay? When we say vanilla JavaScript or vanilla CSS or anything vanilla, it just means we're not using any kind of helper, any kind of library or tool. It's just going to be straight up CSS for this app, okay? I'm going to make a header. So header is an HTML5 element that you can use. If you ever want to look at all the elements, the ones you can use, you can just type in HTML5 elements. And there's a listing of them. Now, I hardly use them all myself. You can see there's quite a few. But there are a couple that I do use all the time. And a couple of those, header and footer, it's just going to be something you use all the time. Main is one, just to kind of wrap my main HTML in the file. But that can depend. You can have multiple mains. Well, hello there. All right. Maybe a section every now and then. And nav. So nav, main, footer, header, and a section. That's the main ones I use. I don't use article and aside and all that stuff a lot, but it's good to do that simply because Google, when you put your site online, Google is looking for semantic HTML. Semantic just means good. It wants to find good written, well-written HTML in your file, meaning you're using all the newest elements. You're using those elements in the right order. And if you are, it's going to put your website at the, towards the top of the list. You get the better your site code is to Google, the higher it puts you on their search results. So that's just the thing called SEO, search engine optimization. So that's just one thing you might want to think about, but it's not important, okay? we're not going to worry about SEO for a while. You probably won't for a long while. Sorry. So let me go into my mockup again here, and I'm going to look at the way I set up my header. So I have a logo over here, and I have a plus sign over here. So anybody have any ideas how I can make that happen with CSS? If I have, let's see, I'm just going to make an H3, and this is going to be my logo. And then right below that, I'm going to make a nav element, and inside of that, I'm going to have a button, and that button is just simply going to have a plus sign in it. That's all I'm going to do. Okay, so if I want to make this H3 on the left, and I want to put this nav on the far right, if I save this at this point and load it in the browser, let's just look how terrible this looks right now. Okay, so right now we have, all right, this is how it looks. Great. So we have recipe hero, and then we have our plus sign right below it. This is just the basic way your browser is going to style elements. It has a very small style sheet. So if you didn't know this, built into every browser these days, there's a style sheet. So you know how you make your own style sheet, you make your style.css file. There's a style.css file built into every browser, and it does some basic styling for you out of the box. It's not great styling. You can use it if you want, but we can overwrite that. It's typically what we're going to always do, overwrite their styling. But yeah, it gives you a little bit, and you can see that here. Put it in a container or div. Okay, so I have a container, so the header itself, this header element is actually a container. So it's containing my H3 and my nav, right? So now I need to make this container, this header element, I need to make it so that the H3 flows on the left over here and the plus sign goes over here to the right side. Floats. Okay, so floats are important to know, not because we use them in our new applications these days, but because of why. Why should we learn floats? Can anybody tell me that? Legacy. Right, so legacy meaning you're going to see a lot of legacy code on the web. When you get a job at a business, you're going to see most of the time, you're going to see legacy code. You're going to see floats in the CSS. You're going to see var and JavaScript. We're all learning var right now, but pretty soon we're going to show you the new version of JavaScript. But you're going to see all this old code when you're working with your business applications and stuff like that. And we have to teach you that. We teach you all the legacy stuff before we teach you the new stuff, simply because that's the thing you're going to see the most when you get a job. Okay, but here we're not going to use floats. I'm going to use something newer in CSS that makes our life way easier, and that's called Flexbox. Now we have I'm going to show you two great things in CSS. One of those being Flexbox and one of those being Grid. I'm not going to go too much into CSS because I want this mainly to be about the JavaScript, but I'm going to show you the basics of these two things tonight, and then I'll kind of paste in some code after that. But so for our header, I'm actually just going to start like this for y'all. All right, so next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and pull in a CSS file for myself. I'm going to make a CSS file, and then I'm going to link to it. So it will load in my HTML file. So where should I put the CSS file? Has anybody started using maybe a different way of creating their CSS files? Well, a file should go in our folder, right? So in the head, yeah, we're going to put the link to the file in our head, but where should the actual file itself go? Assets? Okay. Assets folder. And then make a folder called CSS. All right. So we'll go into assets. We'll make a new folder called CSS. And then a file inside of this. How about style.css? Does that work for everybody? Like that. All right, so now that I have this assets folder, a CSS folder inside of that, and then a style.css, how do I actually link to that in my head? Keyword being link. I'm just going to do link tab, right? And that gives me a link element. It's already has the relationship set to style sheet. So link just lets you pull in different kind of files. So we tell it what file it's going to be. This is going to be a style sheet, and then I link to it here. So what's the path that I need to add here? Who can tell me the path to that CSS file? So I got a dot CSS. Anybody else? Got a dot slash. Oh, assets. Right? Okay, so somebody says assets. So instead of putting the dot slash, we could just put assets. Why is that? Why could I just leave out the dot slash in the beginning? Why is that possible? Same directory, right? So since my index.html file is in the same directory, right, the same level as my assets folder, I can simply just start with the folder name that's a sibling of this file. So think of this folder as a sibling, meaning it's right beside it, or in line with that file in the same folder. So I can start with that name of that folder and just go, and then I can go directly into it that way. Now this will work if you do something like this, right? But you don't have to if you don't want to. Just a little tip. So I'm going to save that. And let's go into our style sheet and let's do body background red just to test here. Hit save. And we have an amazing red page. So what I like to do, the very beginning of my style sheet, when I'm styling on my own without any framework like Bootstrap or something like that, is I like to use a global selector. Now, some people will say this is bad, but these days the browsers are pretty fast. So if I'm not worried about older browsers, which I'm not in this app, then I can use this global selector and make use of it. What I want to do with it is I want to reset the browser styling because it gives margin and padding to everything. So if I just like comment this out for a second and save, you'll see that this H3 has 18 pixels of margin, right? Already styled into it. I don't want that. And even the body itself, if you highlight over your body, you'll see that the body actually has some margin as well that's predefined by the browser style sheet, right? So I don't want any of that. So I'm going to say every single element on the page, no matter how many levels deep they are, whatever, every element that exists in your HTML, I want it to have no margin. That's what this global selector does. The little asterisk, it selects every element, every level deep. I want everything to have no padding initially. And I want everything to have this box sizing border box. So does anybody know what this box sizing border box is? Nope. All right, so in CSS or in the browser, by default, whenever you add padding or borders to an element. So if I added like padding or border to my H3 here, it's going to increase the width and the height of that element. And that's the default behavior of the browser. It kind of increases the width and height. But if you want everything to instead like be pushed inward, instead of increasing outward, it pushes everything inward. And that way you can make it easier on yourself to adjust your padding and margin in the future, or your padding and your borders in the future. You can use this box sizing border box. So that way padding and borders So let me do a comment right here. Padding and borders do not increase width and height. And that's how you do that with this little simple thing right here. So if I save that, come back, you'll see that now my H3 has no margin. My body has no margin, so everything's flush. All right, so we're good with that. Let's move on. The next thing is I'm going to select my header, and I'm going to do something to it. So I'm going to say header, right? And just so y'all see, I'm going to save this, and you can see that my header is selected, and I changed the background to red. Now, you could actually, if you have multiple headers on your page, it's probably good to add a class to this. You know, main header or something like that. I'm not going to have more than one header, so I'm actually just going to select it without a class or anything, okay? But if you have multiple, it's always important that you add the class to that so you can select them separately. Here we go. All right, so who knows how to use Flexbox? Has anybody tried it yet? So we use my web reset. No, you actually don't have to use the reset if you don't want. Reset does some great things, but in this case, we're not going to be doing much CSS, so I'm not even going to use a reset file. All right, so display flex, somebody said. Okay, so let's see. If I select my header and I simply just add display flex, what's going to happen? Notice something. Immediately, the hero logo and the plus sign flow right beside each other. Huh, that's pretty cool. So if we think about this, if you're looking at tabular data, table data, right, on a spreadsheet or something like that. So let me go into like an image. A spreadsheet looks like this, right, where you have columns going top to bottom, down, you know. Then you have rows, so left to right. So left to right meaning like each one of these cells is in a row flowing horizontally left to right. So in Flexbox, as soon as you set an element to Flexbox or Flex, every element inside of that parent element gets set into a row, or it becomes a row per se, and everything, it kind of flows just like a cell row or a table row would work. Everything flows left to right. So now this header is a row, and everything in here, the H3 and the nav, are now left to right inside that row. So Flexbox allows you to do something else too. You can actually, if as long as you have display flex set, if I didn't do this, I couldn't do this next thing. But as long as you have Flexbox turned on, basically, you can say, hey, justify content space between. So this is a property that we can only use on a Flexbox. So if I don't have this set to flex, this isn't going to work. But now, since it's actually a Flexbox, if I hit save and come back, you're going to see that it basically pushes every element in this row as far apart as they can be based on the space that was left over. So all that space that we had to the right of the plus sign and the logo, it took all that space and it pushed these two elements, the nav and our H3, as far apart as they can be. How about that? So immediately we're already getting there with the way our header looks. Okay, that's pretty cool. So let me come back over here. I'm going to change this to an H4. A little shortcut in VS Code is to hold down Command or Control and hit the letter D as in Danny. And you can do that again and select the same exact thing on your code, in your code. So here you saw I selected both the H3s by doing Command D twice. And now I can just change that to an H4 like that. Hit save. Little shortcut there. Okay, so it's a little smaller, but I'm actually gonna style that a little bit. So let me go into my header. down here, and then I'm going to select the H4 inside of it. So if you give a child a set width and flex to another child, the child will fill the rest, I think. Right, you can use flex. So flex is a way of making a child fill a certain width. So if I wanted the H4 to fill the majority of that row, and I wanted the nav to only fill the smaller portion, I could set the H4 to 2, so flex 2, and set the nav to flex 1. So this means that this is going to take up 2 times the amount of space in that row as the nav will. And that's a little thing. As long as you have flex, right? So as long as the, you can see, if we actually look at this, now the H4 is taking up a majority of the row, and the nav is taking up this rest of the section over here. And that's how that flex property works. But this only works as long as your parent, as long as the header wrapping those two elements is set to display flex, okay? All right, so let me go into our H4, and let's set the font size to like 1, or let's do 16 pixels and just see how big that is. So 16 pixels is what it was set to. Let's do 14. All right, why is everything looking so huge? Do I have it like zoomed in or something? I do have it zoomed in. I was wondering. Wow. Okay. So I have my browser actually zoomed in. Sorry about that. So let's take that back out. All right, let's come back over here. And let's change this back to like an H3. I think H3 will be better. There we go. That's a little better. All right, and okay, so we have them splitting apart, and that's fine, but I need to actually fix this so where my plus sign and my recipe logo are kind of pushed inwards from the left and right, because right now they're flush to the side of my page. So over here, I'm just going to leave this out for a second. Up here in my header, let's give it a background of like 5. So this is like a dark gray, like that. And I'm going to use padding. So I'm sure everybody's used padding, but you might have used like padding left or padding right. I'm going to use the shorthand, which is just padding by itself. So the first property in the shorthand is top and bottom. If you only use 2 values, so I'm going to say top and bottom, I want it to be like 8 pixels. And left and right, I want to have padding of 5%. What does that do? It pushes everything in. So top and bottom, 8 pixels. And then left and right, it pushes everything in 5% of the parent's width. So let's think about that for a second. What's the parent of our header? What's the parent element of our header? If you thought body, then you're right. So body is the parent. So it's going to push that header in, the content inside of it, 5% of the body's actual width, which is the full width of the browser at this point, okay? All right, so we have that stuff set. So I'm going to say all the color text, or the text color in our header should be white. So that's going to do that. And what if I want to use a font of some kind, that not the basic font that's built into our browser, but I want to use like my own special font? Who knows how to do that? Google Fonts. Okay, great. I'm going to go to Google Fonts here. I'm going to type in Lato, which is one of the ones I like. I'm going to hit the plus sign here, and down here, I'm going to choose this. I'm going to go to Customize, and I'm going to choose a light, and I'm going to leave the regular. So I'm going to have 2 types of weight, basically boldness. come back over to the embed tab, and I'm going to grab this link tag, come back over, and should this link tag go here? Should it go here or should it go here? Here or here? Above our style sheet or below our style sheet? Above, right. So if I want to reference or use another CSS file, which this is what this is, it's another CSS file, I need to put it above mine because the browser is going to read the HTML like this, right? Top to bottom, it's going to start reading it. It's going to get to this style sheet, read it. Then it's going to read your style sheet, and that means you can use this font up here, okay? Just remember that when you're putting like stuff, links and things, and you're having issues, it's probably because you might have put it in the wrong place. I'm going to select our body. I'm going to say font family. That changes the style or changes the look, all right, of the font. I'm going to set this to Lato, comma, and then sans serif. So sans serif is just the basic no little curly things to our letters, like these little curls you have. I'm going to leave those out, but Lato should be loaded first, and then backup would be the sans serif basic built into your browser font. So there we go. Now everything is set to Lato. Looks a lot better. We're getting there. Our plus sign looks terrible, so I'm gonna select our plus sign. So I'm gonna say header, nav, and then the nav, we had that button inside of it, right? So if I come back over to our HTML file, you'll see that the nav has the button element inside of it. That's what I'm selecting there. I'm going to set the background to none, and the font size, if I could type, font size to, let's do like 16 pixels. That's not great. So let's do 20 pixels. I'm not going to use any other font stuff tonight, like rims or whatever, but we can use those if you want. All right, so now we see that it looks okay, but we're but we have this weird border around it. So I'm going to say border none, maybe. Let's try that. Save that. There we go. And our color is a little messed up. So let's do color white. All right, that looks good. And when I hover over it, I want it to be like a button or look like a button. So we can say cursor pointer. And now when I hover over the plus sign, it looks like I'm about to click a button. So that's a little secret to making it look like a button. All right, now you're noticing one thing though. The plus sign, if you haven't seen this already, it's a little bit below our recipe hero logo. So in Flexbox, there's a way of actually aligning things right in the middle of the row. So if you have multiple elements going along this row, and you want them to be all vertically aligned right beside each other, there's another property we can add to our Flexbox. So up here, I'm going to say align items center. So I hit save. And now you can see that the recipe hero is right in the middle along with our plus sign. So we're rocking it there. Now our plus sign has a little bit of, it's got a little bit of a weird size to it. So let me see line height and see what that does. 1. That really didn't change anything. We'll just mess with it later on. No big deal. All right, so that's our plus sign. We got that, and we got our logo on the left. All right, so getting back to our mock-up over here, I want to have a section in the middle of recipes. So the one thing is, like, you might start jumping into your JavaScript to start building out how you're going to make the recipes work and all that. But I always suggest this, and this is one of the major concepts of building your website from the beginning, right? Is that we need to get a feel of how it's going to look before we jump into JavaScript. let's make the design really how it's going to look in HTML and CSS, and then we can jump into JavaScript after that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a div with the class of recipes. So like this. If you didn't notice that what I did there, I just typed in .recipes, hit tab, and it made the div with that class for me. That's Emmet, which is built into all your VS Code text editors. And in here, I'm going to make a div again, and I'm going to give this a class of just recipe, singular. In here, I'm going to have, let's see. What did I do earlier with this? So I'm going to have like an H4, and this is going to be like a recipe. So let's see, sesame chicken. Then I'm going to have an unordered list, so a UL, and inside of that I'm going to have some ingredients. So 1 cup sugar, we'll just add those like that. If you didn't see what I did there, I just hit Command C or Control C and just hit Command V right after that, and it just paste that same line in right below. Then I'm going to add a paragraph. And this paragraph is going to have a class of ingredients. And I'm going to use some built-in text generators in VS Code. So VS Code is really cool, and it has Emmet built into it. So you can do things like this. I can type lorem and hit tab, and it's going to generate some text for me so I don't have to type a bunch of text out for myself. You can actually use some more powerful features of this lorem text generator. You can type in like, I want to give myself 25 words. You can also say, give me 10 paragraphs. So times 10 will give you 10 paragraphs. So it's really cool the way it works. But by default, I think it gives you like, I don't know, 50 words or something like that. So there we go. I'm going to hit save and come back over. And that's what my recipes listing looks like right now. It looks terrible. So let's give the recipes div a little padding. Like 25 pixels top and bottom and 5% left and right. So I'm kind of copying my header as far as the left and right go. So it pushes everything in right along with that logo. Okay, so here's the cool thing. So let's just assume that we're going to put more recipes into this recipes div as we use our JavaScript to do that. But I'm going to go ahead and put a few in here so I can see what it looks like. So I'm going to put a few in there, just generate them like that, copy and paste. And now we see we have 3 recipes here. How could I set this up or make it look better? Well, what I want to do is kind of make it so it's like little boxes, right? So something like this, and all these boxes are going to be recipes that flow right beside each other in sort of a grid pattern. Class container, right? So if I'm using Bootstrap, container would push everything inwards. That's all container does, is it just gives you a little padding. But here I'm not using Bootstrap, so I'm just using basic CSS. Anybody know of a good way to make things kind of display like a grid on your page? So like in a box grid. So 1, 2, 3 cells, and then I could do something like this, and then it would display like this as it went along the page. Table, inline block. Well, there's actually a thing in CSS called grid. So now we have this grid that we can actually use. So Flexbox is one powerful one, but grid is a newer one, and it's really powerful. So I can come to recipes here, which, by the way, if you haven't caught on, if you're lost on that part, it's the recipes div right here that's wrapping all of our recipe divs. Okay, so here I'm going to say, I want to display those divs. So display all of these divs right here inside of this recipes div. I'm going to display all of these. as a grid. Let's save that and let's see what happens just by default. Well, nothing happens by default. You have to tell the grid how to display. And these properties are pretty advanced, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with them. I will link to, if somebody would remind me later on, actually I'll put that as a note. So let me make a new file here, notes. And let's see, grid game, Flexbox game. So I'm going to give y'all some links to these two things. All right. So the way we tell the grid how to display as far as like columns go, like how many columns do we want? We use this property called grid template columns. All right, and it takes some values, but here I'm going to say I want to have, let's say I want to have 3 columns. So going down top to bottom, 3 columns like this. I could set them up manually like this. I could say I want each one to be just auto, basically take up however much width the browser determines. So I want to have 3 columns and save that. Come back over, and the browser sort of makes it up for me. Okay, that's cool. So we already have sort of a grid going on here. So what happens if I add another recipe down here at the bottom? Save that. Wow. So you just saw, like, without doing much code, I already have the grid working pretty much for me. Didn't have to do much there other than these 2 properties. But I want some spacing between those cells. So right now there's no spacing between them. So I could say grid gap and say, like, give me 20 pixels of spacing in between all the cells. And there we go. So now everything has this gap between it. Oh wait, that's only for, well, that should be for everything. Let me see, 20 pics, 20 pics. Save that, come back. No, I guess that's right. So I think one value gives you gaps between the columns and the rows. Cool stuff. All right, so now let me select the recipe. And let's give it a little padding. So give me 20 pixels of padding on each recipe, top and bottom, left and right. So just shorthand right here, padding by itself with one value is top and bottom and left and right 20 pixels. And you saw now we have this nice gap between everything. So if I wanted to select every single element inside these recipe divs and give them a little margin bottom, every one of them. So I want the H4 here to have some margin bottom. I want the unordered list to have a margin bottom. And, you know, right now I don't have anything below our paragraph, but let's just assume I wanted to select every one of these 3 elements here and give them all margin bottom. A shorthand to do that is to say recipe, go into the recipe and give me the direct children that are anything. It's weird, right? So I'm saying recipe, direct children that are a anything. I could say that are a paragraph, direct children that are a span, but here I'm saying direct children that are anything and give them all a margin bottom of 7 pixels. And you can see instantly each one of these elements has 7 pixels bottom. How cool is that? Shorthands in CSS are an amazing thing. Okay, so we're all set here to go with our basic layout for recipes. I'm not going to do much more to those at this point. Is grid responsive? Well, let's see. Down to about right there, it's going to start looking a little goofy, right? So what do we do with that? Who can tell me what I should do if I wanted to make this look better at this width as far as the browser goes? media query. That's the perfect answer. So I'm going to go down here. I'm going to say @media max width. And what was that width we had? Let's just see. 8 or 5 or 830. We'll just say 850. So at 850 pixels, when we get down to 850 pixels, let's select the recipes div. And let's say our grid template columns is now going to be only 2 columns instead of 3. So I'm going to save that, come back over, and check it out. As we get down to 850, so I'm here, I'm getting down. We get down to 850, and boom, we go to 2 columns. Now it looks way better, doesn't it? Not much there to make this responsive. Well, that's the power of grid. It makes it super easy to lay things out on your page in this grid kind of format. Just meaning like cells, columns, rows. Think of it like a table. You're displaying it like a table. And you can determine how many rows and columns there are and how they work. Now, there's plenty more properties for display grid, so I'm going to send y'all a game that lets you learn that. Okay, when one recipe is longer than others. So let's come up here and let's say lorem times 3. So what if we had an extra long description or instructions for our ingredient, or for our actual instructions, right? So you can see that it actually handles it pretty well. So let me just close this out for a second. Every one of these are going to be the same exact height. It's going to determine the height of each one of these cells basically by the highest, or the one that has the most height. So if I inspect all of these divs here, you'll see that each one of them in this, you can actually, the browser kind of gives you a cell view as you highlight over them. You can see it, all those are the same exact height, which is pretty cool the way it works, okay? So we could actually do something even cooler to make it more visible. We could say, give me a border of 2 pixels, solid 555. Kind of make that border a little bit curved by adding some radius to it. Save that, come back over. And now we see that we have a nice little border around each one of those. And our UL, the little bullets, our unordered list, the bullets always go outside. For some reason, I'm not sure why the browsers still do that to this day. But let's go into, let's say recipe UL. And let's say, you know, padding left 25 pixels or something. And there we go. So it's going to push that UL over to the left a little bit for us. And now you can see that it looks pretty cool at this point. We go down to 850. Yeah. So you could probably change that to like maybe 1000 or something. There we go. So as we get down to 1000, switches to 2 columns. Cool. All right, who's all lost at this point? Anybody lost? Anybody need to ask a question real quick before I move on? Nobody lost? I like it when that happens. That would be great. All right, cool. So the last thing we need to do for our setup here is just add a footer. So I'm going to come down here. And right outside of our recipes div, right above our, if I could spell footer, that'd be awesome. I'm going to make a footer. And I'm going to do a paragraph. And this paragraph, I don't know what that was. I guess that's a new extension I added or something. Footers are killing me. Okay. I'm going to make your life, I'm going to change your life tonight with footers. Let's do copyright 2019 boot camp. And then on the right, I want to have like another set of text that says like created by GT student team, right? So we're going to create this together. So we're going to put that down there. So at this point, I have my footer, but what I want is this text to be on the left and this text to be on the right. How do I get them to stay at the bottom? Let's go over that in a second. So, okay, so we saw that in our header, I was able to use Flexbox to make everything on a row, right? Put everything in a row and then also split them apart. So thinking about the header, could I not use that same concept for a footer? Right? But here's the problem. What if I want to do it for my footer, but now what do I need to do? I need to actually say display flex. Again, justify content, space between, again, align items once again, and save that. It works great, but what are we doing here? What's the concept that I'm doing that we're starting to learn? Maybe you've heard this concept. What am I doing that's not good here? Dry, exactly. Don't repeat yourself if you can help it. So how can we make this code better, write this code better so I don't have to repeat myself? A class. That's perfect. How about a class that has these settings right here, right? But how about let's break it down even further. So class is good, but what if we did something like this, where I came up here and I made a comment and I said, I'm going to make some global, oh geez, all right, global classes for myself. So these global classes, it's just a naming convention for classes that we're going to use over and over again in our code. Who all has used something like this in their code? A class called row. And you use that because you are using what in your CSS? Or you were using what for your web page? You're using Bootstrap, right? How about we make our own row class? I'm not using Bootstrap at all here. I'm just making my own one up. What could that be? What if I just took display flex and put that as my row? Isn't that going to display all the elements of that container as a row, right? It's going to put them left to right. So that's a basic row, is it not? So how about that? How about I do that? So now I'm going to come back over here to my header. Let's add the class of row. Let's come down here to our footer and add class of row. So now I have the display flex thing out of the way, right? I'm going to take this out for a second. And let's take out all three of these. Save, come back. Okay, so now we see that it's a little bit broken, right? All that row class does is what? What does our row class do at this point? I'm testing you without showing you. It just displays it as flex, right? So flex just puts everything left to right in a row. It doesn't do the rest, those two other things we did, right? All it does is take those two elements inside our header, the two elements inside of our footer, and it puts them on a row left to right. That's all it does out of the box by default, okay? So those two other things I did, I need to add those back into the mix too. So I'm going to make a class called split. I'm going to set that to justify content space between, right? And this is going to push all the elements left to right as far apart as they can be with the space that's left over. Let's go back over and how could I use this class now, the split class, and add it so that my header displays as a flex box, but also uses that justify content space between and pushes everything as far apart as they can be. How could I use this at this point? So add split class. So that would go like right here after the row, like this. All right, let's save that. All right, that works great. So I can simply just come down here to my footer and add that class to the footer as well. So split. Cool. But we're still getting that vertical alignment issue where the plus sign is a little bit below our H3 over here, our logo. So I want it to be right vertically aligned. So I need to make one more class. And we're going to call this align center. I'm just going to make it exactly what it's going to do. Align items center. So I think everybody's getting the concept here. I'm going to add this to our footer and add it to our header. So stacking classes, right? We make classes that we're going to repeat over and over again. Why would I not want to put all of these separate things that I just made into one class that I could use over and over again? Why would that be possibly a downfall later on? Because what if I only want to display something as a row and not align them center and not split them apart, right? So if I made a class that did all three of those things, then I would have to back away. I would have to reverse basically, right? And take some things out later on, or I would have to manually just say display flex in this element, you know, instead of using my classes. So that's why we kind of break it down to the basic form. We say, all right, I can use this to make something display flex, which is the basic bottom, right? And then I could add some more stuff if I needed to on top of that. So that's why we break it down. You're going to see that in Bootstrap as well. The classes are very basic. They'll start at the very bottom, and then you'll add more classes to do more things. And that's the concept of your CSS as you're writing it. Start at the very bottom, display flex, and then build on top of that, adding more features to that if you need them. But we don't have to use these two features, but we can if we want it. Okay? All right, cool. So we have the footer and we have our header working now. Should be working now pretty well. Next thing is I want this footer to remain at the bottom. So let's go ahead and give our footer a little styling here. Background. Padding. Let's do like 6 pixels. Something like that. Maybe more. Let's make it big. Like that. Keep highlighting text. Let's make all the text that I can white, just by simply selecting color and white. It's going to change all the text to white. All right. So we can see where our footer is at this point. It's up here right below all of our other elements, right? Because we're not pushing it down to the bottom and we're not making it go to the bottom. Who has an idea of how we could put it at the bottom and keep it there? Always. Not to bug us. We want our footer to stay out of the way at the bottom of our page. What's how we position fixed? Okay. That's cool. So let me try this fixed thing first. So I'm going to say footer position fixed bottom 0 left 0. So remain fixed in the browser window. Don't move at all. I want you to start from the bottom of the page and start at the left, right? So if I save this, okay, we have an issue immediately, which is the width is gone. So we're going to have to say width 100%, so that we get our width back. All right, that's cool. But what if I do this? What if I take this footer and I move it up? Do we see something weird happening here? It's overlapping everything, right? So z-index would probably be important for some browsers, yeah, because it might not be above everything. So we might need to do z-index as well of like 5 or something. Negative margins, okay. What if I told you you could make a footer stay at the bottom and also flow with the content of the page without overlapping using Flexbox? Ooh. What if I told you I could get rid of all this? Right? Let's come back over to our HTML and look at it. So right now we have our body wrapping our header, right? Our recipes div. It's also wrapping our footer. So I could use the body element actually as a Flexbox container, and because of that, I could make some stuff work my way. So let's say body display as a flex. I'm going to show you why I'm not using the classes in a second, but I'm going to say display flex. So I don't want the Flexbox, the body, to flow as a row, because you notice if I just save this, we're going to come back and everything is flowing left to right, right? Because that's the default, the way a Flexbox works, left to right. I don't want it to display as a row. I want it to actually display as a column, so top to bottom. So the way you do that is you can say flex direction. Instead of a row, the default, I want it to actually be set to a column. So now it's top to bottom again. And that's cool. Let me actually take this so we can see that our footer is still jacked up. Right? Now I want to split this. So I'm going to say justify content and space between. So same thing, same concept as before, but now since it's a column top to bottom, it's going to split everything top to bottom. Now we're going to see an issue here. If I highlight this, it should push everything. So with the space that we have left over down here, right, it should push these 3 elements, the header, the div wrapping our recipes, and the footer. It should push them apart as far as they can be. But we're seeing that that's not happening, but we can inspect and really quickly realize why not. Looking at our body element itself, let me actually break this out so y'all can see here. All right, looking at our body element, we can see that the body is actually not taking up the full height of the page. So how do we make that body take up the full height of the page? Anybody? Hey, that's a great idea. So I'm going to say HTML element and body element. I want your minimum height. So I want you to be at least 100 viewport height of the browser. So viewport height, VH, just means the view of the browser. So when you open your browser up, what do you see right here, this window? That's the view that you see, right? So we want it to be 100% of the view that you currently see in your browser, okay? Save that. And now we see instantly that things are starting to happen, right? So the header is now at the top. The recipes are right in the middle, smack dab in the middle. And the footer is down at the bottom. Now, no matter how I move this around, you can see that the content does not change. I can always still, if I move this up to even this height, I'm still able to scroll down and my footer always remains below all of my content. It's not overlapping anymore. It's not floating around. That's great. There is one issue though, and you might like this design where the recipes are right in the middle of the page, but what if you wanted them to still remain up here right below your header and them not to be smack in the middle? Anybody have any ideas how we can make that happen? Remember that this justify content space between is pushing these 3 elements, the div in the middle, the header, and the footer at the top and bottom. It's pushing them apart with all the space left over. So how could I make that happen? Well, what about if I just took my recipes div and the header div and just wrap them in another element. So now, what are the two children elements of our body? Our body is the flexbox column, right? What are the two elements in our flexbox column? It's now the main element, right? It's only the remember I should have mentioned this earlier, but remember that flexbox containers only affect the direct children elements. So this all the stuff inside of main now is not going to be affected by the body flexbox, right? It's only going to affect the main element, and it's only going to affect the footer down here. So now those two elements are the children of our flexbox container. And we're saying split those two children, right, as far apart as they can be. Let me close this or bring it back down here. Exit out. And now you can see that we now have our original styling, which is the recipes are right up here where I want them to be, and my footer remains at the bottom. And now no matter what, my footer always remains below our content, doesn't overlap or anything. And it will stay there at the very bottom no matter what. All right, so whose lives have been changed by this Flexbox tonight? The power of Flexbox. Yeah, so Flexbox is awesome, and you can use it along with Display Grid as well to make some amazing, easy things happen in the browser. Laying your content out, it's going to be super easy. My faith is confirmed. All right, so what if I want to make a form? So let's imagine that I'm going to click this button here. Notice when I click the button, let's do one thing real quick. You'll notice when I click it, it has this ugly blue outline. That's just the default in the browser. So I can go over here to our style sheet and right up here in my resets. So we tend to call anything that's reset or anything that's changing a main element, you know, not a class that you specified, something like that. It's changing like a global element on the page. We call these resets. Everybody's heard that before, right? You used a file called reset. We have done some resets ourselves tonight, right? These are all resets. We're actually affecting main global elements on the page, the HTML body, all of the elements right here, right? And now I'm going to say all the buttons on the page, no matter how where the buttons are, how many levels deep they are, I want them to not have an outline. So I'm going to say outline none. Save that. And now when I come back over and click that, it doesn't have that ugly blue outline. Okay, that's what that comes from, that outline property. What I want to do is click this in the future, and we get a form that pops up. But let's go ahead and make our form, and so we can see what it's going to look like. So right below our main element here, I'm going to say, let me make it like, what is I'm going to call this here? Let's say class of recipe modal. I'm going to give my div like that. And then in the modal, we're going to have an H2 at the top. And this is going to say add recipe. And right below that H2, we're going to have a form. Nobody has used a form element yet, right? Has anybody used a form element? Does this work for buttons that are added by JavaScript? Yes, so CSS is going to affect how everything looks, no matter if they're added later on by JavaScript or what. Remember that CSS is the way we make things look a special way, right? Look a certain way. So yeah, as long as your CSS is loaded up here at the top of the page, your JavaScript might change things, but this is going to be affecting the way things look no matter what. We can overwrite this. Maybe you have a style set on a button a certain way, but later on in your JavaScript, you want to make that button look a different way. We can overwrite your style that you've already created here through JavaScript. But if you don't override it in JavaScript, this is going to always be the ruler of the way the things look, okay? All right, so going back to where we were, what was I saying? Resets, button, outline, good. Oh, we're at this point. Sorry. I'm at the form. So I'm getting down here to my form. I saw a few people said they used a form before. So a form is just a way of getting information. So it's like just a bunch of boxes you can type into. How do we create those boxes to type into? Well, we use a few elements. So one of the major ones you're going to use all the time is called an input element. So if I create an input, the type attribute here. So these green things you see in VS Code are attributes. They call them attributes in HTML. So the attribute for the type of an input element determines what kind of box or what kind of input this is going to take. Well, if we want to have a way of typing into a box, we need to tell it that we're going to have a text input. There's many of these types of inputs. We can have a radio, which is the little circle you can click on. You can have checkboxes, which allow you to like check a box with a check mark. But the basic one we're going to use all the time is a text input. So it's just simply a rectangular box that you can type text into. And then we can use a placeholder attribute to tell or to show the user what they should type into this box. So this is just some placeholder text. This isn't going to affect what is written into the box or anything. It's just basically a way of showing the user what they should type. So I'm going to say type. For now, I'm going to say type name of recipe. Hit save, come back over. At the bottom, we see we have our form started here. I can click on it, that input box. But what I want to do is go ahead and set this up to where this recipe form is going to take up the whole entire page, overlap everything, cover up our header, our footer, our middle content here, cover up everything. So how could I make it so this element, this recipe div, or this form div, covers everything up? What is something we could do to make that happen? Z-index, yeah. But what would Z-index come from? What would we use before Z-index? So I want to take this div right here, and I want it to make it go above, like float, not float really, but per se, but be on top of everything else. How about we go down here to our, right below our recipe stuff. Let me say recipe modal. I want you to be position absolute. What does that do? So if I just hit save, we see that immediately our div has been popped up here to the very top and it's floating above everything else. So that's what absolute does. It takes it out of the context of all your other HTML elements, kind of sets it into its own world. So now it's in its own world. How can we make that work for us? Well, I'm going to say, I want you to start at the top left. It already is, but we're going to make sure it does that in all browsers. And I want you to say, or I want it to be at top, and I want it to be at the left 0. So flush to the top and flush to the left side of the browser. I also want you to take up 100% width of the browser. That doesn't do much, but if I set the background to, let's say white, we can now see that it's covering the width of the browser. And what if I said min height 100 VH again? How about that? How about that? So now it's covering my whole page. That's where we're getting somewhere. And I want to make sure it's on top of everything. So we use Z-index at this point to say, let's make sure this is always, make sure this is always 10 levels above everything else. 2 days easily. You get faster and faster, believe me. So now I want to make this a column. So I want to display everything in this form as a column. a flexbox column. So we're getting to a point where I'm about to use I'm about to copy or repeat my CSS that I wrote up here, right? So this thing right here. So let's do this. Let's take this flexbox or flex direction column. Let's actually take the flex display out and our justify space between out of our body. So now body is not going to be styled as a flexbox. That's cool. I'm going to add a couple of classes here. So I'm going to say if I create a column class, if I add a column class to an HTML element, I want it to be display flex, but I also want to make sure that columns are displayed with a flex direction of column. How about that? So now I've added a couple of classes here, or one class actually. And so I can go up to my body and say class display as a column, a flexbox column, but also split everything with justify content space between. We can't see that, but it's working, believe me. And now I'm going to go down to my modal and I'm going to add the class of column. And that's cool. Nothing's really happening right now. But what if I wanted to be all in the middle of the page? So let's say align center. Really quick. That's working great. All right, let's come back over to our CSS and let's say padding 25 pixels, top and bottom, left and right 0 because we don't need any padding since it's going to be at the very center of our page anyway. Let's get back to our form. So I'm going to copy over a bunch of inputs and stuff. And I'm just going to walk you through it here. So I showed you like how we could create an input. But if I paste in all of this and save it at this point, and this form is going to be a column as well. All right, great. This looks really ugly though. So our form works. We can actually click on these little boxes, but they look terrible. So I'm going to grab some CSS that I wrote for it, and we'll walk through this CSS in a second. Form, here we go. Let's come back over. So don't want to spend all of our time on this, but I'm going to save this, come back over, and modal. Okay, so let me just copy all of this over. Actually wrote quite a lot of CSS for this. This is funny. I think it was this much. Save. And let's get rid of the display none. Then we'll walk through this. So display none, save. There we go. So now I have this nice little form that I styled all with CSS. Now you notice that we had, before I styled it with CSS, it just looked like a bunch of little tiny boxes that I could click on. But notice that now that I've used CSS to add some styling to it, it looks way better. Now we also get this blue outline on the inputs, so the boxes that we have here to type into. I can simply go up to the top, and for that outline for my buttons, I can just do comma, input, comma, and then any text areas as well. I'll show you what a text area is in a second. And now you'll see that when I click on these boxes, we don't get that blue outline. All right, so getting back to our HTML, let's look at what we have in our form. So I added some extra inputs here, but the first one we see is a basic text. You saw that I showed you what that looks like a minute ago. It's just a basic box that you can type into. Placeholder is used to add some text to show the user what to type. I then added a paragraph here that just simply says ingredients, and then right below that we're going to have a list of ingredients that the user adds. So as I type into this box right here with an ingredient, I hit add. It should then add the ingredients to this list right here. So that way, when I go to save the recipe, I know that all these ingredients that I have added right here are going to be saved to that recipe. This is a good way of creating a form where the user knows what's going on. If I didn't have the listing right here as I added more ingredients, you might remember which one you added and all the above. So that's a thing called user interface, user experience, right? I want to make sure they know what's been added. I also have a what do I have here? That's the add button. So this input right here is for the ingredient, the box for the adding the ingredient. Right beside that is a button to add the ingredient. Right below that is a text area. So text area is another box to type into. So we have input, type text to type into. We have text area, right? And that's a bigger box. So if you want a big box that might give you more space to type a whole bunch of stuff like this, that's what we use a text area for, okay? Don't overthink this. Inputs and text areas are just two ways of getting text input from the user, okay? And then right at the bottom, I have this button that says Save Recipe, okay? And that's what this button is right here. And you'll notice I have a couple of different things here. I have IDs on my inputs. My button has a class of add. My text area has an ID of instruction, right? My button down at the bottom, my save button, has an ID of save. So I have some IDs here. So why would I add some IDs to my elements? Anybody know? What's my plan if I'm adding these IDs? What's the main reason we use IDs? To style, okay. We got a to style, to reference in JS. So understand this concept, right? Styling is to make things look a certain way. If I want to make sure an element on my page, one element has a particular way of grabbing it later on in my JavaScript, no other element can have that particular way of grabbing it, so there's no confusion. We use an ID because IDs can only be used one time, a unique ID. So this word instructions here can only be used one time in my HTML file. I cannot have a div with a class or with an ID of instructions as well. This would be invalid. So if I have two elements with the same ID, that's invalid in HTML. You can only have one unique ID per file, okay? So that's what IDs are used specifically for most of the time, is just for JavaScript. Selecting one element that you gave a specific ID to do something with later on, okay? Not precisely for styling. So I wouldn't use it for styling, but you can select it in your CSS using hashtag, but that's not required, okay? All right, so we got the form set up with HTML. Going back to my CSS, I did add quite a lot of CSS here. I'm going to share this all with y'all later on. You can go through it. It's nothing crazy. It's just, selecting those elements inside the modal we made, the recipe modal, which is that div that's just wrapping this form here, right? The main div that's covering everything up. I selected that. I selected the form inside of it and styled the form elements in certain ways, okay? I added some padding to them, some color, some font size changes, nothing crazy. So don't think the CSS is going to blow your mind. It really isn't going to blow your mind. It's just basic stuff, okay? Here I selected the save button, that button at the bottom of my form, and I gave it some specific styling as well to make it look better, right? So if you've ever seen a form before, you might have used one in Bootstrap that's already made for you. I've done that manually myself. And so you can actually check out some of those stylings that how you make a form look a certain way or whatever. Okay, so getting back to this, we also need a way of closing this out. So I'm going to make a little element 2 at the top of my modal. And this element's going to be, like, let's do it like right below this. We're going to say button. And let's add a class to that button. So we're going to say close modal. So this little button is simply going to close the modal out. So I'm going to save that, come back over. And based on my styling that I already had made over here, you can see I have the recipe modal, close modal right here is where I selected it in my CSS, and it is absolute positioned at the top, 5% from the right. I changed the font and did a couple of things with that X, that letter X, you know, and I made it look like this. So now it looks like a pretty little button that you can click. And when I click this, I want this form to go away and show my recipes again. All right, here we go, folks. So y'all ready to dive into some JavaScript? I know we didn't go into much tonight so far, but I think everybody's probably appreciating the CSS kind of work through. I noticed that. I'm kind of catching on that everybody's probably appreciating the CSS stuff tonight. Because if you want your app to look a certain way, we tend to get confused between CSS and JavaScript, right? We think JavaScript's going to do all that for us. But no, we actually always remember that CSS is the way you make things look a certain way. Don't try to do it through JavaScript unless you need something to change later on dynamically, right? That's the only time you're going to use JavaScript for styling, is when something needs to, you click a button and your box needs to spin around or something like that. That's when JavaScript's going to be used to change styling. But always build your styling before you start coding your JavaScript as much as you can, okay? And that's what we've done here. No JavaScript has even been touched yet, and we have our app almost looking like it could work. It feels like it could work, right? That's my kind of goal usually. I want to make the app look and feel like it could actually be working right now, but it doesn't, simply because we don't have any JavaScript to make it work, okay? All right. So what's the next thing I should do if I want to use JavaScript? Who can tell me the next thing? We want to start the JavaScript journey here. Create a JS folder. So I'm going to go into my assets, create JS. Inside of that, I'm going to create a file. So what do y'all name your file? What's your typical name you give your JS file? JavaScript JS, JavaScript.js. Okay, that's a good one. How about let's make ourselves look like nerds. I'm gonna do app.js. That sounds nerdy, right? You could do like, you know, scripts.js or something like that, but anything JS. I'm gonna use the name that I like to use all the time, which is app.js. All right, getting back to our HTML file, how do I pull this JavaScript in and use it? This is totally not a trick question. How do I pull our JavaScript in? After body, tag it, head. So we got head, we got after body, link. We got quite a few things here. So what's the element I need to add to my HTML to actually load JavaScript, to load this file? So we use link tag to pull in our CSS file. What's the element I need for JavaScript? Script at in and bottom. Let's do a test here. So I'm going to add a script tag right below our CSS. I know this might frustrate some of you, but let's do a test. The script tag takes an attribute called source, src. If you think about that, src, source, just means where's the source of this JavaScript coming from? So that makes any more sense to you, the way that source attribute works. We're saying, where does this JavaScript come from? It comes from assets.js app.js. That's where I want this JavaScript to come from. Okay. Come back over. This is not going to do anything, right? So if I open up my console, we don't see anything. We don't see anything happen on the page. Our JavaScript is doing absolutely nothing at this point. But what if I say console.log test? Awesome. It works. Our file works. Our file loaded. There's no issue so far with loading it right here in the head, right? But let's dive a little further. So I don't want to dive into too much vanilla JS as far as like selecting elements in the DOM, right, in the browser. I'm going to use jQuery for selecting. Who wants to see vanilla versus jQuery? jQuery makes your life easier as far as selecting stuff from the DOM. But we can do some vanilla if y'all feel you want to do that. But I would say we should probably use jQuery. Access elements that have been defined. Okay. All right. jQuery is the consensus. So I'm going to go to Google, type in jQuery CDN. Grab that. One of these links. I usually go to cdnjs.com, but you can go to jQuery if you want to. I usually grab the one right here that says jQuery min.js. Copy that. Now this only gives you the URL, right? So if I said script brackets source equals paste tab. Oh wait, it's gonna. There we go. That worked. That's a shorthand way of doing it in Emmet, but long version would be like this: script tab, source equals. Let me paste that URL in there. Right above our JavaScript. So let me test you all. If I put this below our JavaScript and I hit save and I come back over here and let's look at our HTML for a second. Let's look at our header and then our H3 inside the header. So what if I said jQuery, select the header element and then the H3 inside of that and change the background, CSS background to red. Who all thinks this is going to work? With where my JavaScript is right now, where jQuery is right now. No? All right. Save it. Come back over. All right, what do we see in the console? We see $sign is not defined. What does that mean? What does $sign is not defined mean to us? All right, so it means that this $sign right here, this function, jQuery, the function itself, right? This $sign does not exist. We cannot reference it in our file simply because we haven't loaded it before our JavaScript. So remember that just how CSS loads before your HTML, right? Loads in order. Same thing happens with JavaScript. So as the browser is reading this file, it gets down, it loads our JavaScript, which says jQuery do something. But then after we say jQuery do something, jQuery is then loaded. So we told jQuery to do something before it was even loaded in the browser. So that's an issue. So let me move this back up. And by the way, I'm holding down Control Command. I think it's Control Alt on Windows. Control Command for me, and I'm hitting up or down. And you can actually select a line of code with your cursor like this. And you can move it up and down your file like this. So it makes it really easy to move stuff around. You can actually do multiple lines of code. So if I wanted this whole header element to be moved down here, I'm just holding down Command Control and moving it up and down. All right, cool. So now if I save this, come back over here. All right. Oh, let me take our for right now. Let's make sure our modal is not displayed. So I'm going to say recipe modal. Let's just display none on that, and that's going to make that modal go away. But check it out. Our logo is not red at this point, right? So what's the problem here? I told the logo to be red. jQuery is loaded. It's working fine. But for some reason, our H3 is not being turned red. Why is that? So Jacob said it didn't exist when you tried to do it. jQuery, jQuery is loaded before your HTML is loaded. That is exactly right. Perfect. So what's happening is the browser is getting down here. It's reading our JavaScript file. We said jQuery, change the H3 background to red. Then the browser continues reading. And at this point, on line 17 is when the actual browser gets to the H3 and loads it. So we told the H3 to be red before it even existed. So that's the problem. So how could we solve this issue where when I select that H3, it turns red? With the same code I have in my JavaScript, how could I make this work at this point to make sure the browser knows that H3 exists? Exactly. So we take this code or take our JavaScript that we wrote, right? We don't want this JavaScript to run until way down here below all of our HTML, right above the closing body tag. So we're just saying load all of this HTML, make sure it's all loaded in the browser, and then after all of it's loaded, run our JavaScript file. That's as simple as it is to make sure the HTML is loaded first. And now notice the H3 is red. It works. Who is confused by that? 1 to 5. 1 being I completely am lost on that concept. 5 being I got it. Everybody give me a number 1 to 5. Everybody, you're amazing. All right, let's go. Here we go. So we got our JavaScript loaded in the browser. Okay, here's the concept here. I want to push upon you tonight, and that is, what are some things that I want to happen immediately when the browser loads? So JavaScript, thinking about JavaScript, what are some things that I want to happen immediately when we load this page? So looking at our page here, I've loaded it. Think of yourself as a user visiting our app here. We're making this app together, and we're thinking about users visiting our app. What's the first thing our JavaScript needs to do at this point? Oh, by the way, we had a question about the jQuery being at the bottom too. You can, there's no problem putting the jQuery down at the bottom above closing body along with your scripts. And I tend to do that myself. I tend to put all of my JavaScript stuff down here at the bottom, right above closing body. Just remember that jQuery is not changing any HTML, right? It's not affecting any HTML. We're using it to affect HTML, right? We're only telling jQuery to mess with the HTML from inside of our file. So because of that, as long as it's not affecting the HTML on the page, it can be loaded in the head, right? That's just a little tricky concept that might confuse you a little bit. But yeah, that's why I had it at the top as well. You can put it down there. I'll put it down there. Anybody have any ideas on what our JavaScript should do at the beginning? Open your minds to the power of JavaScript. It's gonna help our app turn into a magical do things app. Right now, it looks pretty, but it doesn't do anything. Document.ready. Yeah, we could do that. Remember that document.ready does what? Who can tell me what document.ready does in jQuery? Right. So if document.ready loads the HTML, but at this point, we've already set our JavaScript up to where it makes sure the HTML is loaded before it runs, do we need document.ready? Exactly. So let me test that theory. So getting back to our code over here, if I do this, yes, the H3 exists in the browser before our JavaScript ran, so it works. But if I take this code and let's go back to our old ways, put it up here, doesn't work anymore, right? Because the H3 doesn't exist. But if I go to my code and I say, hey jQuery, as soon as the document is ready, I want you to do this. Ooh, everybody getting that now? That making more sense? That's what document.ready is for. It's basically doing this, what we just did, for us. It's basically loading our JavaScript after all the HTML is done loading. So we don't have to put our JavaScript at the bottom, but the common practice these days is to put it at the bottom so you don't have to do document.ready. Remember what I said about legacy code, right? You're going to see a lot of document.readies out there. Believe that. So we had to show you what document.ready is for, okay? All right, so what I want to do is I want to set up some listeners here. So right now, when my page loads, the only actions that are going to really take place at this point is when I click on this plus sign, I want our modal to show. I want our form to show, okay? That's the first action I want to take place. So I want to set up a listener. So immediately upon the page loading, we can click this button and make our modal show. Now, we could say, what is our button? What do we give it? Let's see, plus sign. I didn't give it any class or ID. So let's give it an ID of open modal, something like that. So I'm going to go to my jQuery, and how do I select our little open modal button from our navigation? Anybody? What should I use in my jQuery selector? Right. So we use CSS selectors to select things in jQuery. And what's the next thing I want to do if I want to set up a listener, right? So when I click on this button, something happens. What's that next thing? Dot on, right? And dot on is a method. It's a function, right? So we call it. All right, so we put click in there. Okay, so far, what's the next thing? Comma function, right? So let's make sure we get this concept because some people might still be a little unclear. We're saying jQuery, grab that button. jQuery now has the button in its hands. Think of it like a literal person with the button inside their hands. And we're telling jQuery, with that button in your hand, when somebody pushes on it, I want you to call this function. When somebody clicks on that button, I want you to call this function, but only when they click on it, okay? So I'm going to go into this function, and let's just say alert. Hey. So I'm going to save this, come back over, hit the plus sign, and we have some action going on, right? We now have JavaScript doing something cool. It really has no point to our app, but yeah, I just wanted to do something cool for a second. Okay, so I have our first action kind of set up here that I wanted to, but what if I have multiple actions? So let's step forward here a little bit for a second. Let's say when I click that button, I want this div right here to show, right? So I have a class of recipe modal on my div. So what if I said, hey, jQuery, grab that div, and I want you to show it. Who thinks this is going to work? Remember how I told some of you jQuery makes your life simple? You kind of say it out loud, and jQuery usually has a method that just works. Oh my gosh. It worked. Or did it? It shows the modal, but what's the problem here? What happened when we showed it? CSS is kind of gone. The CSS for the form is working fine. But remember that we displayed our recipe modal div as a flexbox, right? Now, when you use the show method, it's going to display that element as block by default, okay? So what happened, I said display, I said show, it set it to style right here, display block. Now, if we wanted this to work right, we needed to set this to flex. So how do we overcome that? How do we make this the show method work for us? Well, in this case, we don't have to use show. We could actually use CSS and say display flex. So go from display none, which it is right here. Remember I said it a minute ago to display none. Now I'm going to say in jQuery, select that div and set its CSS display to flex. So it's not going to be none anymore. It's going to be flex. Let's check it out. So now if I click on it, look at that. Our modal works just how we want it to do, or want it to work. And it opens up. Now what's the next thing? Well, if we're going for basics here, I want to click this X and I want the modal to go away. We've gotten somewhere with this button, so what could I do next? Let's go back to our HTML. Let's look at our modal. We have a button inside that modal div with a class of close modal. Set another click like the one before. Okay, how about that? So let's go close modal, which is that X button we have right here. Select that and say on click. Let's call another function here. And let's say recipe modal CSS display none. How about that? Let's save that. Let's come back over, click the plus sign, it opens fine, click the X, it closes. Everybody's starting to be blown away by the just the incredible amount of magic we've already created here. It's not too crazy yet. We're going to be getting crazier as time goes on. But shorthand for this, because a show will display as block, the method hide will display to none. So this is a shorthand for what I just did. CSS display none. Hide will do that for you. So if I save this, come back over, open it, and then close it, works the same exact way. We don't have to type out the whole CSS display none thing, okay? Shorthand for display none, by the way, in jQuery. What are we seeing here? Well, flex and none is referring to after CSS right here. Oh, yeah, okay. So looking at this, CSS, so we're saying select that element, change its CSS, property of display to flex. Looking at our CSS file, what does that look like? If I was to select our row class, right, and make sure row is set to display flex, it's now a flexbox container, right? So this is the property and this is the value. So in your CSS method, this is the property and this is the value. So just think of it like you're writing CSS, property, value, property, value, okay? 11 seconds later, I'm lost. Okay. Okay, super easy when you explain. All right, cool. All right, so what are y'all noticing here? I'm writing this code. What is the concept I mentioned earlier we need to avoid? What are y'all seeing here? Dry. All right, we're repeating not a lot of code yet, but we're repeating some code already. So we might want to change our mindset here as far as like how our code is going to be written. How could we do this, right? Well, let's back up a little bit to setting up some initial listeners. So I want to show you all a concept that I learned a long time ago. And I want to put y'all ahead of the game. So anybody that attends these sessions and checks this stuff out, I'm going to give y'all some concepts that are going to put you ahead of your fellow peers that aren't attending, aren't watching, right? I'm not doing this to make y'all better than them, but I want y'all to see some of the cool things and some of the concepts that we don't have time to cover in class. We're going to be showing y'all a lot of stuff, just mountains of information, right? But some concepts are bonus, right? Bonus concepts, I call them. All right, so here's this thing. We learned about functions, right? I've showed y'all a little bit about functions. Well, I'm going to write a function and I'm going to name it init, right? You can name this start. You can name this, begin the app, load, whatever you want to call it. But I'm going to call it what we developers, experienced developers call this. We call it init, which is short for initialize. Okay, meaning like when the page first loads, when the user first visits our page here, initialize our application, meaning start the whole process that makes this app work the way it should work, right? So we call this init for short, and this function should be called immediately upon the browser loading. So I'm going to go ahead and come down here. I'm going to say init this app. Well, what is our init function doing right now? Absolutely nothing. What if we take this stuff and just paste it into here? All right, that's fantastic. Now if I come back over, we see that it still works fine, right? But now we've moved it into our init function. Something else though, I'm writing a manual function here, just an anonymous unnamed function for each one of these click events. What if I separate this to where if I showed you, if I came to class today and I said, hey, check out my code I wrote. If I showed you the code, you could immediately, within a few, not immediately, I guess, but within a few seconds, understand what's going on in my code. Who can tell me an idea here, a concept where immediately upon looking at this file, we can start understanding what's happening in our code? Extract the functions. Yeah, right. So what if I wrote a function that was like show modal, and I wrote a function that's like hide modal? If you looked at this right now and these two functions, you probably could assume, if you didn't know what a modal was, you might be confused by that. But since you all know what a modal is at this point, which is just an overlaid thing on top of everything else, then we know that this function is going to do that and this function is going to do that, right? So let's take this code inside of here, cut it out, and instead of writing the function manually right here, all you have to do in JavaScript, this is a JavaScript thing actually, you just give it a reference to some function that you've already written in your code. Like this. If I've written a function, think of this as being pasted right here, right? I mean, we're not giving it a name. What I am doing is I'm saying JavaScript, when this button is clicked, I want you to call show modal function. Now, you notice I'm not putting parentheses beside it, right? Because I don't want JavaScript to immediately call it when the file loads. I only want it to call this function when the button is clicked. So this is called a reference, right? We don't call it. We don't put the parentheses after it. We just put the name of the function here, and it's going to call it as soon as that button is clicked. So I take that code up there. Let's do the same thing down here. Paste this in here. And hide modal. What if the function takes a parameter? That's a good question. Okay, so if the function took a parameter and I wanted it to be passed to our function up here, there's a couple of things we can do. One of the first things is we could actually write a manual function. I don't know what's happening here. So hide modal. So what if I come up here, I could take this, write a function out. And I could call show modal from inside of here. And I could pass something to it, right? And it could receive that. Or some text, whatever it is, okay? And then I could use that text inside the function. Now, shorthand these days is something like this, which is going to be a little bit wonky too, but right. So this is JavaScript, brand new JavaScript, so it makes it a lot easier to write. Now, don't worry about this for right now, but just to show you that we can make that happen either way, longhand or shorthand, like I just wrote. But we're not going to really actually need to pass any arguments to these functions, so I'm just going to write them like this, okay? Let's go back to where we were. Click that button, show modal, click this button, call hide modal. All right, let's go back over here. Let's run it, see what happens. Works fine. Now, you see we might have added a little bit of code here at this point. But if I showed y'all this in class tomorrow, just imagine that I hadn't talked about this tonight and I showed you this in class tomorrow. Reading this file with the skills you have right now, do you think you'd be understand what's going on a little bit, right? What if you showed your classmate this? It makes a lot more sense to your brain when you read a file that's split apart functionally, right? So if I place click behind show modal, and it shouldn't make any difference. What do you mean? If I place click behind show modal, like over here, like that. Yeah. So the method or the listener comes first. So what type of listener comes first, which is click in this case, and then the function that you want to call when that event happens comes after. So first and second, that's important. Yeah. All right, cool. So we have a concept here, and this is called functional programming. Oh my gosh, have you heard that before? It's a nerdy term for separating things into functions, making things run functionally instead of procedurally. Procedural means the way we wrote it originally, line by line. We didn't have any functions. We were just other than our click functions, right? But now we're splitting it apart where it's functional. It makes more sense. That's called functional programming, okay? All right, so we have the open and close working fine. Now, we don't have much time tonight. We're going to continue these sessions, but I wanted to go over some basic concepts here. We're getting our JavaScript going. Who all wants an extra 15 minutes or so? I'll give you an extra 15 if everybody's cool. If everybody has to run, then I'll probably just shut it down and we'll continue next week. All right, good. All right, so that's enough, people. So we'll continue on. So let's see. Getting back to our first initial things that need to happen, we click on this. It opens the form up. I click and close it. That's cool. What about adding a recipe? So let's get our form working. Now this is going to be the trickiest one, okay? This is going to be some more advanced JavaScript, but we're going to walk through it as we build this app together over the next week or two, okay? The first thing I want to do is what? If I want to make this form work, who can tell me the first thing I need to do with this form? Store the input info. Okay. Really though, how do I get the input info? How am I going to get it when they submit it? What action needs to take place for my JavaScript to receive that information? Think about more basic than getting info. What's the on click for the save button? Right. We need to make this save button work, right? Because right now, if I click it, only thing that happens is what? What happens when I click that save button? Nothing. Not really nothing. Notice that something's happening when I click it. What is that? Everybody watch the top up here, the tab up here. Watch what happens when I click that save button. So watch right here in the browser at the top of my browser tab up here. Watch this. What happened there? It refreshed. Exactly. So when you make a form in your HTML, the default behavior of the browser, when you click a button inside of that form, it could be any button. So notice if I hit the add button here, or if I hit the save button, any button element that I have inside of that form, I have two. I have this one, and I have this one right here. Any button is going to make the browser refresh. And the reason it does that is because the default behavior of a form is to submit information to a backend. Right? So if we have a backend running, which you're going to be learning in the future pretty soon, we can submit information to it. What happens is the backend is going to receive the information from this form. You can do something with that information on the backend, and then you can send something back to the client, which is the browser here. And at that point, right, as the browser refreshes, that's when they would see the new information sent from the backend. That's the default behavior, but I'm not dealing with the backend here. I don't have a backend. So what I want to do is keep that from happening. I want to make sure the browser doesn't perform the default behavior. So who can tell me, like, have they heard anything about how to prevent the browser from performing the default behavior? What is something you might have heard? Let's start with this. Let's grab the button. So let me come back over to my HTML. Let's see. I gave it an ID of save. Prevent default. Right. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to say grab the save button, and on click, I want you to call a function called save recipe. Okay, so let's make that function up here. Function save recipe. All right, that's awesome. All right, so Jennifer said prevent default. So how does that work? So if I want to call a function called prevent default that makes the browser stop any default behavior, let's find out if this works. So if I click a button, right, nothing, it still works the same exact way, nothing happened. Where does that function lie? Where does prevent default come from? Where do I get this function? It's actually not existing right now. This does not exist. It's attached to something else. jQuery. Well, actually, it's built into JavaScript. So whenever you click or whenever you perform an event, so right here I'm setting up a click event on the save button. I have a function that's being called by default in JavaScript. It's going to pass you an object of information. So let me just put a parameter here. Let's put something like this, right? You click the button, it calls this function. This function receives an argument of some kind. Let's find out what that argument is. Console log, oops, should have copied this. Console log this. Whatever we receive from JavaScript, let's see what that is. So let me go over here, click this. Now you notice we saw something really quick, right? We couldn't see it fast enough because the browser refreshed. But what if I told you this argument, whatever you're receiving, it has a method called prevent default on it. This looks really goofy right now, but I want you all to understand that it's not something magical. So if I hit this now and I hit save, check it out. The browser didn't refresh, and we can now actually see what this magical thing we got in our function, right? And what is this? It's simply just an object with 100 different properties. All of these properties contain information about this event, meaning when I click that button, JavaScript formulated or created an object. Remember, objects look like this. All right, and they have properties and values. So JavaScript created an object of information with a whole bunch of properties and values on it. And we can simply use those properties to get information about the event, or to call some methods and do certain things, right? So if you look, if I look at this, there's client X right here. This property tells me exactly where this button, this element right here is, save recipe button. It tells me exactly where this button is on the X axis of the browser, meaning the horizontal axis. So from left to right, it tells me that it is 949 pixels from the left of the browser right here. Also tells you where from the top of the browser it's located. So from the top, 483 pixels down is where that button starts. So you have all this information about the event, about the element that was clicked. So much we can do. So this is just simply an object of information and methods, right? We call this the event object. Now you might be seeing something familiar here. So this event object is passed in. We have all these methods and properties. One of those methods is the prevent default method, okay? And it stops the browser from performing the default action that should take place, which is refresh the browser when a form button is clicked. So we said, browser, don't refresh, stop that. Don't do anything else. Just stop what you're doing. And oh, check this out. So we have an issue here with our overlay, our modal. I said minimum height is the browser height, our viewport height. So at this point, I forgot to go over this earlier. We actually need to set this to 100%, 100% height of the browser. Let's see what happens there. Okay, so it's still it should be display none, shouldn't it? Oh, that's our modal. Okay. Let's see, 100%. height 100%, I guess I should say. Well, we'll work on that later. But oh, I guess it's because I shrank the browser down. No worries. We'll get that figured out later on. Okay, so going back to this, I can click on the save button. We can now stop the browser from refreshing. So going back over here, what now should I do to collect the information from the form? So if I type something into here like sesame chicken, right, and some instructions, let me grab some lorem text from this site called Bacon Ipsum. So if you like bacon like me, there's a site called Bacon Ipsum where you can grab some placeholder text for yourself. Come back over, I can paste that in. All right, so now when I hit save, what should I do to start gathering information from that form, from those boxes? So I'm typing into this box. I'm going to be typing into this box right here, and I'm typing into this box as well, but how do I get that stuff from the browser? This is where it all goes bad, yeah. So a lot of people get confused at this point. So assign a variable to input. Okay, on click append. All right, so the first thing I need to do is I need to somehow select this box here. So select this input and get the text right here that's been typed into it. So in JavaScript, there's a thing called value. So all input elements have a property value, which is this text right here. So when you type into the box, whether it's a text area or an input, there's a property on the element called value that you can get this text from. So jQuery gives you a little shorthand version of that. So if I create a variable here and I say name input, or let's say name val u equals jQuery, select the input right here. Remember I gave it an ID of name, so I'm going to select that one. Give me its value. So that's the shorthand in jQuery. So jQuery has a method called val. It allows you to grab whatever was typed into the box from this element. Okay, so check it out. So now if I console log this, name value, this variable I just made, let's take this away, save this and come back, plus sign, sesame chicken, hit save, there it is. Is that blowing your minds? We're getting happy? All right, cool. Let's go on. So we got the value of our name for the recipe. We need to get the instructions. So let's get the instructions. Very long name. I think I gave it an ID of instructions, but let's look to make sure. ID of instructions right here for our text area. Get the val for that. Let's console log both of those and see what we get when we hit save. So boom, sesame chicken. Let's grab some text, pop it in here, hit save. So the first thing we see is our sesame chicken name, and then after that we also have the value for our text area. We're going places here. So what about our ingredient though? Our ingredient's a little tricky, right? Because we could add multiple ingredients. The purpose of this button right here is to keep adding ingredients one by one to a list of ingredients. What's something in JavaScript we use to store a list? Well, UL is used for array, right? So UL is used for HTML lists, but to store it in JavaScript, we need an array, right? Okay, so this is the tricky part we're going to start getting into here, and that is, how do I get those? How do I get this list as it's added? Because if I just say, give me the ingredient value, and I say when, so ID of add, okay, val. Once again, let's make sure we get this cleared up here. So I'm getting the value of that input that I wrote the ingredient into. So here I could say some ingredient, hit add. Oh, so what's happening there again? I hit the add button. We notice that when I click save, the browser stops the default behavior. But when I click add, what happens again? Push it to an array. Yeah. So notice that our only button that's actually stopping the browser from refreshing is the save button, okay? So we need to make sure that add button also does the same exact thing. Now, if you wanted the add button to be used along with this same function right here, we could simply just do a comma. Because remember, this inside this string right here is a CSS selector. So you can select multiple elements just like you would in CSS. We could say add and save button. I want you both, when you're clicked, to call the save recipe button. So if I hit save, come back over, let's go to sesame chicken, let's go to some ingredient, hit add. Oh, did I say add? Let me make sure this is, oh, class of add. So the the button has a class of add. Let's change that to this. One cup soy sauce, hit save. And there we go. So now both of those buttons are calling that same function. And that might work in some ways, right? But I want this button to work differently. I want it to just keep adding to this list right here. So I need to set up two separate event listeners. So I'm going to take this away. And I'm going to say when the add button is clicked, I want to call add ingredient. Right, so let's go up here above our save recipe and let's write a function called add ingredient. So now we're moving here. We got append. Yep, we got some stuff going on to try to figure out what we're going to do with our ingredients. Okay, so if I said browser don't refresh the page and I wanted to get the ingredient, that's cool. What if I said ingredients equals an array and I want to get the ingredient value, which is the add input and its value, right? I'm just going to write this out and then we're going to go through it, push ingredient value. Okay, so we created an empty array here, nothing inside the array, just empty. We grab the value from the input, right? So from this input right here, we push it to that array. At this point, we could console log our ingredients array and see what happens. So let's try this. Come back over. I go to add ingredient, hit add. It works so far, but what if I do this again? So let me go take this away. Let's add another one. Hit add. What happened there? Who can tell me what happened? Made a new array. Why is that? Why did it make a new array? looking at our code here, what's going on that's causing it to overwrite our old array, replace it with a new one. And so we don't get both the values. We only get the one that was currently added. We're doing everything we need to do, but we're missing one vital concept here that's causing it to break, sort of. Right? We're pushing to an array. We have an array of ingredients, but so far, every time I change this and add a new ingredient, all I can get is the current one that I typed in. I don't get the previous two here. I only get the current one that I typed in. This is a very important concept. If you want to keep adding something to one of your variables, right, but the function is called each time this button is clicked, simply try this. Take your variable, your array, let's move it to the top up here above everything outside of our function. So now our function, when it's called, doesn't create a new variable called ingredients that's an array. It's actually going to push it to the array that already exists in our global code up here. This is called a global. Yes, right, King. So we're creating a global variable. The function can affect or change or update this variable up here, but we're not creating it brand new every time this function is called. So knowing that, let's try this out now. So let's go back over. I'm going to say 1 cup soy sauce, add that, delete that, some ingredient, add that. Uh-oh. Everybody's starting to see the beautiful thing happening here. What do we have now? We have the whole array of all of our ingredients, don't we? All right. Is this starting to break through some of that fog you've been having a little bit? Globals and functions and all this stuff. Maybe it's starting to click a little more. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Believe me, I was there exactly where you are right now. I've been doing this for over 10 years. I've done it thousands upon thousands of times. It's not that I'm any smarter than any of y'all. My brain is not some giant expanse filling the entire void of space. It's that I've repeated these same things so many thousands of times that I remember them. Okay? Remember that repetition is key here. Repeating the same things. Coding at home outside of class over and over again, the same things. You're not going to forget, because when you're sitting there writing your code and you're like, what was that thing about how do I change the, make the elements flow left to right? What was that thing JD said? Oh, let me do some research for 5 hours. Finally you find Flexbox and you're like, Flexbox, God, I just spent 5 hours looking for Flexbox. That's what it was. Are you going to remember that? Are you going to remember that next time when you write that code again? Probably, right? Because you don't want to spend 5 hours again looking for Flexbox. You're going to remember that junk because you don't want to research for 10 hours again. That's how this happens. You remember it because you repeat it. You don't want to have to repeat the search for it again. So it starts sticking. It starts clicking, okay? That's me. I've been there. I've been in those 2-week-long search for a way to make this function work, and it's like about to break some stuff, and I finally figure out how to do it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, man, 2 weeks. But I remembered it next time. Believe that. All right, so here we go. We got our array working now. That's storing the event or storing the items because it's now global, so it's not being recreated each time. That's good. But at this point, how do we actually use those ingredients to update our form? So the one last thing tonight before we stop, I'm going to make this little ingredients list right here work. So knowing that we have the array up here full of all the ingredients, how could I affect this UL right here, right? Take away this paragraph inside of it and start adding list items instead. Each time I add an ingredient, I want that UL to be updated with list item for each one of the ingredients in our array here. Append to the ID for that. Append a paragraph. Well, not I'm just going to add list items, so li tags. I just put this paragraph in there just for some placeholder text until we get some ingredients in there. But at this point, I want to select that UL from the DOM, and for every one of our ingredients in this array, create an li in that UL. Let's go with that concept. So here we go. We push the ingredients, or we push the ingredient that we just typed into the array. We grab the UL from the DOM. So let me come back over. What did I give it? I gave it a class of pending ingredients. So let me grab this since I created the longest class name ever and paste that in. And let's say I want to append a li. What do we see here for an issue so far? If I want to, for every one of the items in our array, I want to append a new li tag. What's something? The key words being for every, do something. So think about that. For every one of the items in this array, for every, hint, hint, for each, for loop, yeah. So you can use more advanced loops if you have learned them, but we're going to use the basic for loop tonight. I want to loop through that array, so I'm going to say for var I equals 0, I is less than ingredients.length. If you're still struggling with arrays, I would definitely urge you to reach out to your instructional team and or make sure you sign up for a tutor. So speak to your SSM, Sarah, about a one-on-one tutor. Okay. Also, if you can't get a hold of Sarah, go to BCS, the BCS website. At the top right, click on support or help. I forgot what the button's called. You can actually sign up for a tutor through there. If you haven't gotten one yet, get yourself a tutor if you're still struggling with concepts like for loops and variables, arrays, and stuff like that, okay? All right, so for loop, we're inside the for loop here. And I'm going to say, at this point, I want to append a new li for every one of those values in that array. So how do we make the value, right? Each one of these values, it could be, you know, multiple. So for every one of these values here, items in the array, how do I add that text right here? 1 needs to be inside here. And then 2 needs to be inside of this li. So how do I get the text right here inside of the li tag? Yeah. Show modal not show modal. Show modal is going to show the actual modal itself. This whole page right here. I want to add every one of these words right here from the array up here. Ingredient I. All right, so let's try this. So let's say li, close this out, do a plus sign, ingredients. So I'm referencing the array name up here, right? Our ingredients array right here. How do I get values from an array? If I say ingredients array, give me the current value. No worries, King. Ingredient I. How about this? Plus and then we close the string out. So check it out. Let's go through it, right? We create an li tag. We add the current value in our array. So it's going to start with 1, then the loop's going to run again. It's going to go to 2, and then we're done, right? So for these 2 items, we're going to create 2 LIs. The text of those LIs is going to be what? It's going to be the current value in the array as it goes through. So this will be 1. The next time the loop runs, it's going to be 2. Does that make sense, everybody? But I'm using dynamic code here to make that happen dynamically, right? So this is dynamic, meaning we're not manually hard coding the letter or the word 1. We're using JavaScript to dynamically pull the values from this array one by one and place those values into the li tag, okay? How about that? So let's just try this without doing anything else at this point. Let me just go some ingredient. Oh wait, let me get rid of these 2. So all right, now we have an empty array from when the page first loads. And then I hit some ingredient, hit add. So, okay, so what's happening here? So if I do some ingredient, take this away, 1 cup soy sauce. Oh, wow. So every time I hit add, this is increasing in height, I guess, or something. Also, our paragraph never went away. So what's the issue with that? Why did our paragraph, our initial paragraph that just said no ingredients added, why did that not go away? Why did this not get erased? What in our JavaScript here is causing that paragraph to not go away? Append, right. So append doesn't remove the previous HTML, it just adds to the bottom of the previous HTML. So we had a paragraph initially, so it's just going to come in here, it's going to add an li right below that paragraph and continue doing that as we hit that add button, right? So append does not erase the initial HTML. We have to remember that, okay? So what could I do to make sure each time we click that button, the previous HTML gets erased and we only go through our loop, right, and add the items from our array each time. So erase the previous HTML and refresh it with the items from our array. Display none. So display none is CSS. So that's just going to hide it in the browser. It's not going to actually remove HTML or anything. So check this out. What if I said, okay, UL, unordered list, I want to set your HTML. So all of your inner HTML, I want it to just be gone. Is it as easy as that, JD? Well, yes, it is. We say, set all the HTML of that element to nothing, an empty string. And then we start our loop. How about that? So let's go back over. And let's do some ingredient, add. How about that? What if I add another one? 1 cup soy sauce. Uh-oh. We're getting somewhere. And another one. How about that? 1 to 5 on where we're at right now. So, 4. Oh, that's good. Awesome. All right, cool. So we've gone way over time. I'm going to end it tonight, but you can all see how we're starting to get this process going here. App creation isn't some kind of crazy rocket science stuff that you'll never understand, because I know a lot of students tend to at this point go, yeah, this stuff is just not for me. It's never going to make any sense. It's just too complicated. Well, we have to understand that you can break everything down to the most basic concept, even in your JavaScript, okay? So what I'm doing here is breaking it all down to arrays, pushing to an array, a basic for loop, basic selection of elements. We're doing all the basics here, but by combining those basic things that we've learned in JavaScript, we're starting to make this app work. Do you not think that moving forward, we could use basic concepts we all know to complete this application, make it fully functional, right? And if you think, yes, you are correct, we could use all your basic functionality, basic fundamentals that you've learned to make this app work. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to actually do that in the coming weeks as we continue our review sessions. Okay? Yes, this is going to be recorded. I've been recording it, so all good. Give me 1 second. I hope y'all didn't hear that. I just had the biggest cough ever. Okay, I'm going to end it for tonight, but we're going to come back to this next week. So I will send out the code that we have so far. I'll send the video out. I'll also give y'all a couple of links to some things like CSS, Flexbox, Grid, some ways of learning them, little fun game that you can use to learn them. You're very welcome. And we'll continue this later on, okay? So y'all have a great night. Thanks for coming. And make sure to tell your classmates, hey, come check out this review session thing, because we're learning some concepts, right? Some things that we don't have time to go over in class. JD's going through them in our review sessions, okay? So we'll see y'all all next week, and have a great night. You're very welcome.